Okay. Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Very
No
good.
problem,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. I think for our first speaker, we're supposed to have Steve Boyles, but I think Steve is in a doctoral exam this afternoon. And I believe that his colleague Tingquo Zhu is supposed to be here. Tingquo, are you here?
I don't think he's in the even on the attendee list. I don't think so.
Okay, well, that's fine. I wonder if Xianming Shi is here.
I'm here. I could, present if I need to.
Could you go now?
All right. Let me share my screen. Just a sec. How about? Does it work?
Looks good.
You see me? All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Should I get started?
Yes, sir. You may go ahead.
All right. Thank you for being here, everyone. Today, I'd like to share with you some of the findings from this CAMMSE project 16 from calendar year 2020. And our presentation title is Effect of Multimodal Connected Vehicle App on Transit Stop Catchment Area. And my collaborators are Dr. Khan and two students, Tanvir and Antoni, who did the heavy lifting. They're both at the West Virginia University. Now, why do we need look into this issue? First, let me start with a little bit of background. Transit service accessibility is important for proper planning and improving the transit ridership. And people usually walk or use bicycles to get to the transit stop. Of course, there's always a challenge with the first mile and last mile connectivity. Inclement weather conditions, transit route delays and route changes or cancellations, all these undermine the accessibility and mobility at transit stops. So it's kind of intuitive. If the users are more informed, they can make better decisions and therefore reduce the bus stop waiting time significantly. Connected vehicles, as we heard so much about today in the session, that is becoming the new thing. And these CV applications could potentially improve transit services by decreasing the stop wait time and decreasing the overall travel time and potentially increasing ridership. So here are our three research questions. First one, can the multimodal CV app increase transit accessibility by sharing real-time information? Second one is, does the CV app reduce the transit stop wait time? Of course, if so, that would be really beneficial, especially when the weather is pretty bad, like winter weather. Third one is, to what extent the transit service areas can be expanded if such an app is introduced to users to facilitate the non-motorized accessibility to the transit. So the contributions of this study start from, we developed a smartphone-based app for transit users to collect and disseminate real-time transit information, such as the bus location, average bus speed, estimated arrival time, and weather information, road weather condition data, and also the user's own trip information, such as his or her distance to the transit stop. And also we measure the improvement in the transit accessibility by quantifying the expansion in transit coverage area compared with the without app scenario, which is the control scenario. We actually run some field investigation to get this data. So it's more than just a simulation, I guess. Finally, we quantify the increase in the available capacity of the transit routes based on the reduction of transit stop time, waiting time. I'll get into that detail a little bit later. First, let's start from what people have already known in this related area. First of all, access to transit stops or system accessibility models usually deal with physical access to public transit stops by evaluating distance, time, and effort to reach a transit stop. That's the kind of model we're dealing with in this study. And previous studies assessed the benefits of real-time transit information sharing or RTI sharing, mostly by analyzing the survey data or using simulation-based approach. Survey data, of course, is somewhat subjective, and to identify the transit stop catchment area, there were a few studies in the last few years. The first two use the data collected from, again, travel surveys or origin destination surveys. As we know, they're not always accurate. And the other two studies use mobile phone trip data and GPS data, which contain the detailed trip trajectories. And of course, they're much more reliable. Now, usually we know to define the transit stop coverage area, the circle for walking distance of a pedestrian is about 0.25 miles or 400 meters. However, El-Ghanidi et al. Found that the 85% percentile walking distance of transit stops was about 0.5 kilometer or 500 meters for home-based bus trip origins, or even more so, 1,300 meters for home-based commuter rail trip origins. So in other words, there's still the first mile and last mile connectivity issue. And of course, biking, in addition to walking, could be an alternative to address this issue. And in the literature, usually the real-time transit information sharing has three different benefits. First one is really reduction in waiting time. This is a case study done by Breakwood et al. And then Tang and Thakuria conducted two studies to explore additional benefits of RTI sharing. The 2011 study reported 76.1% of respondents would increase transit use if RTI is available. In other words, there's benefit in terms of increased ridership. And the 2012 econometrical modeling study found an increase of 126 average weekday bus trips per route due to RTI. So again, this was limited to a model simulation. Again, due to the reduction in waiting time, there's a third benefit, which is reduced overall trip time. Now, then what is the gap in relevant literature? None of the previous studies explore the transit stop coverage improvement in the presence of RTI sharing with the user, especially with apps nowadays, smartphones everywhere. So in this scenario, if we can couple the multimodal app with real-time GPS tracking data, we might be able to determine walk time, stop waiting time, and overall trip time. So here's our method. We developed basically what we call a multimodal app. In essence, two subsystems. One app is with the traveler, we call it a travel CV app, which disseminates real-time information of the bus or the arrival time and delay and so on, and even the back racks to the transit user. And this app basically, this is the simple interface where also feeds the real-time weather and road condition data to the user. And also, again, this is the bike lane availability and capacity data at the bottom. And there's another app which is part of this system, and the app is installed on the bus. So to collect real-time information such as the location of the bus and the capacity of the bus. So in this study, we try to measure the app benefits in three different ways. The first is the stop catchment area, measured as a zone around the transit stops from where the transit service can be assessed by walking or biking. In this case, we focus on walking. And this study assumed this 400 meter or 0.25 mile radius area from a bus stop. And the second performance measure is the stop buffer area ratio, which is an indicator of transit supply defined as the portion of the area served by the transit service. And the last one is the origin destination-based supply index, which is an indicator of available capacity of the route, defined to characterize the quantity and quality of public transit resources provided to a zone when traveling from one zone to another. So here's our experimental setup. We recruited 10 young adults living in West Virginia University campus, and the age is around 18, ranged between 18 to 35 years old, and they took basically a total of 100 trips. And they were divided into an intervention group and a control group, and the intervention group were given the app, so they have real-time access to the trip trajectory data, and we can track down, actually, in this case, for both groups, we can track down the trip trajectory data and average trip speed, wait time at the bus stops, first and last mile connectivity time, and so on. And then in order to diversify the trips, they were taken at different times of the day and different weekdays. So the area is basically the campus, Morgantown of the university, and the study was using tablets on the buses and smartphones for users to collect the GIS location, travel speed, and so on. And the route is shown in the map on the right here. It's about 4 miles with a dozen bus stops with a headway of 20 minutes. It's a relatively rural area, typical college town. And this is just a kind of proof of concept sort of field study. And the first finding is that the app significantly decreased the stop waiting time. For instance, just we sampled a few scenarios where there were 2 trips taken in the afternoon, and you can see without the app, the typical stop wait time is 6 minutes, and with the app is 3 minutes. So there's a significant reduction, and this is very intuitive. Now, the second performance measure, or the measure of benefits, was the stops buffer area ratio, like we mentioned earlier. So our assumption is that because there's a 2-minute and 50-second reduction in average transit stop waiting time, and if we assume the buffer area is basically a circular, distance from that bus stop, you can see the orange is without the app. Now with the app, the area grows a little. And then with that in mind, then we examine the different scenarios, and you can see in zone 1, we saw about 10% increase in the SAR, and in the zone 2, we saw about 23% increase. So these are very encouraging. Now, the third performance measure we used was the coverage area improvement for the route. So in this case, earlier we assumed the circular area, but that's not very accurate, tends to overestimate the benefits in some cases. So in this case, we try to use actual road network and travel time. So the orange lines show the zone, with the current practice without an app. Now, if with the app, basically you're extending this coverage area to the blue zones. So so in other words, before the app coverage was 32 miles of roadway. Now you can extend to 44 miles of roadway, and that translates to a 37% increase. Very encouraging. Now, yet another measure was the transit supply index, or ODSI. So you can see for both origin destination pairs, we saw a significant increase, and that also indicates increase in transit supply. And now, when we try to extrapolate this, one route study to the entire region, here's what we did. Look at this. Well, the MLTA, or Mountain Line Transit Authority, is the only transit service in the region, and they currently have 24 routes. And we extend the findings to the entire area, and the orange polygons show the current coverage area, and then the green zones are the additional benefit due to this app application. So we use census tracts to serve as origin zones in order to calculate the SAR, and the average SAR before the app was 0.34, and afterwards was 3.34. And nearly also we double the coverage of population. So, because one thing is the area coverage, the other is population coverage. So to conclude, the benefits of a multimodal app was measured in terms of 3 related performance measures, stop buffer area ratio or SAR, coverage area improvement for the route, and origin destination based supply index. 10 young adults were recruited for field data collection with or without using the app. On average, the transit stop time was reduced by 2 minutes and 50 seconds, and the SR value increased by 10 to 23%. With the app, the transit route service area can be increased by 37%, and the ODSI reveals that the multimodal app for RTI sharing notably increased the transit supply. Of course, again, like I mentioned, this is just a proof of concept kind of study. So in future study, we would hopefully do more. The first one, instead of just one route, it could extend to the network level so that we more accurately estimate the network level benefits. The other one is we, instead of focusing on walking as the single measure to address first and last mile connectivity, we could look into biking or maybe even other things like e-scooters. The third one is we're looking at very rural area. So if it's a highly dense populated area, probably the outcome would be a little different. So ideally, we should look into a more heavily urbanized environment where the transit services tend to have lower headway. And finally, we haven't tested in the actual inclement weather, like winter weather conditions, how the app could be beneficial. So with that, I'd like to thank the Tier 1 UTC CAMMSE for the funding and also welcome your questions.
All right, do we have questions from anybody? I don't see anything in the chat box. I had a couple questions. One, I noticed that you said you recruited 10 young people. How young were they?
Sorry?
Remember, how young were they? What was the maximum, what was the oldest age person you had?
Right. Actually, I did mention in one slide, 18 to 35.
Okay.
The argument is, I mean, the fundamental assumption is there was a study showing that people aged between 21 and 30 tend to use such tools more frequently for their travel. So, like you alluded to, probably the older the generation, probably the less likely they'll use the tool.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. Do you have any comments about how old a person could be that would still be likely to use it?
That's a very good question. In my mind, there's never an upper limit. I think it's really like, I mean, age should not be the issue. But again, I'm not speaking scientifically. I mean, I'm just thinking from people I saw, like you can always learn the new tool. This is, of course, the interface needs to be probably a little more intuitive, or maybe larger fonts and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think our experience has been that I can't define the word older, but older people tend not to be as tied to their smartphones as younger people are.
Well, definitely. Just look at my kids versus myself. I see the difference.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned e-scooters a couple times. We've looked at e-scooters a couple times in terms of whether or not e-scooters really serve a first mile, last mile purpose for transit riders, and found very slight correlation in a few areas around Austin. But generally speaking, the correlation is very, very small. I wonder if that's true elsewhere. It's been true in Austin. There's been a lot written. Go ahead. There's been a lot written about e-scooters and the potential of using them for first mile, last mile connection to transit.
Yeah, very, very good question. Actually, I don't think we put e-scooters in the report. It just occurred to me, we had this conversation probably 1 or 2 years ago. You were doing a study on e-scooters. I figured, so that was just like a spontaneous reaction, not really in the report.
Okay. Anybody else have questions? Excellent presentation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Randy.
I believe that our first speaker, Tinku Zhu, is here now. I think, Tinku, are you here?
Oh, let me stop
Yeah, I'm
sharing.
here.
Sorry.
Okay, good.
Sorry, I need to figure out how to stop share, or can somebody do
I'll
that
be-
for me? Oh, here it is. All right. Thanks.
All right. Dr. Boyles, Stephen Boyles, my friend at University of Texas, is listed as the author of this paper, Two-Stage Robust Facility Location Problem with Drones. And I think he's in a doctoral exam this afternoon. And so his colleague, Tingwu Zhu, is going to make that presentation. Tingwu?
Hi. Hello. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Tengku Zhu, and I work with Dr. Boyles. And I'm very glad to have the opportunity to present here. And the topic of this research is called Two-Stage Robust Facility Location Problem with Drones. So so first, the motivation. First of all, the past few years have witnessed the increasing adoption of drones in various industries, such as logistics, agriculture, military, and telecommunications. And because drone delivery is an efficient delivery method that are unaffected by ground traffic, and it has fewer carbon dioxide emissions. So in this research, we present a short-term post-disaster humanitarian relief application where we use drones to deliver first aid products to some customer points after the disaster breaks. Let's jump into the problem description. So a brief description of the problem is that an agency wants to deliver some first aid items, such as medicine or blood, some very time-sensitive items, to several demand points. This we call the customers in the research. They're using the drones to do this, so the number of drones are limited, and they deliver the items after the disaster outbreak. So there are three different kinds of decisions to make, which are location decisions, which means the location of the facilities of the warehouses, and the allocations, which means that you needs to allocate the limited drones to the facilities, and assignment plans, which means that he have to assign each customers to each drones and assign each customers to each facilities, open facilities. So in this research, we assume a two-stage planning process. Where in the first stage is called strategic planning stage, where the agency need to make the location and allocation plans. And so he needs to locate the warehouses and allocate the drones to the open warehouses before the exact customer's demand are known. So in the first stage, he doesn't know the exact customer's demand, but instead we're given an estimated demand that is used to help him to make the decision. And in the second stage, where the operational stage begins, so he needs to make the assignment plans where he needs to assign each customer to the drones. And by that time, the actual demand will be reviewed, which means that in the first stage, when he makes the location and allocation plans, it does not know the exact customer demand, but instead we're given an estimated demand to do so. So one of the key assumptions of this problem is that location and allocation decisions are made before the exact demand are known. Some reasons are when the disaster happens, so the different regions will have suffer different severity of the disaster. And another possible reason is the delay of information. So it takes some time for the exact demand of the customers to be collected and reported to the planner. But at first time, but the planner has to make the location plan and allocation plan as soon as the disaster breaks to, like, it's a time sensitive application. So because of these two reasons, we assume that when they make the location plan, which is very urgent in the first place, the exact demand are not known. So we're here to model the demand in this way. So WI here is the nominal demand of the customers. Could be used an estimated estimated or expected demand of the customers, and WI delta is actual demand. So in the first stage, we only know the WI, but in the second stage, the WI delta will be reviewed, and their relationship is like this. So we assume each customer has a theta I, which is a customer associated disruption parameter, which means that this is the parameter, and SI here is the disruption indicator continuous variable, which means that after the disaster outbreaks, so the actual demand will lie in between this region. So the actual demand of each customer lies in this region and is continuous variable. But since SI here controls the disruption, so there is a budget of the SI. So the sum of this is less than parameter. So there is a budget on the severity of the disaster. So basically, each customer has their actual demand lies in this interval, but we don't know this by the time when we make the location and allocation plan. So there are some other parameters such as maximum number of disruptions. This is a disruption budget. There's some battery capacity of the drones, and there are some limited number of open facilities. And the distance between the customer and the facility, there's some demand cost of serving customers, and there's some demand penalty cost if a customer's demand is not fully served. So there's some demand. Theta I is a demand change parameter, which is a parameter associated with each demand. So there's some capacity associated with the facility and the drone. So, and in terms of decision variables, we have, like I said, there are 3 different kinds of decision variables. The location plan, which is YJ here, is a binary decision variable, and ZGK is the allocation plan, which means how do we allocate the drone K to the facility J is also a binary decision variable. And XIGK is assignment plan, which could be binary or continuous, depends on the 2 different models. And SI here is the worst case is the second stage decision variable, which indicates the worst case scenario whose cost we aim to minimize. Because the demand are stochastic in some way, and we're using a robust optimization approach to solve this problem, which means that we're trying to anticipate the worst scenario possible for all the different scenarios within that demand set. So we're trying to minimize the cost of the worst case scenario. So its formulation is like this. So the objective function of this problem is trying to minimize the total cost, where the first term Fj, Yj is the fixed cost associated with the location plan. And the second stage cost, or the second whole term, where it includes the transportation cost of serving customers and the penalty cost if a customer's demand is not fully served. So we have some, the constraints are, the constraint 2 here indicates there's some limited number of facilities that could be opened. And the constraint 3 indicates that a drone can only be assigned to a facility if and only if the facility is opened, whereas the constraint 3 indicates. And constraint 4 indicates any specific drone can only be assigned to at most 1 facility. And constraint 5 just domain constraints. So this is just so the constraint 2 to constraint 5. These are the first stage constraints, which means that we make the location and allocation plan based on all this. This is 4 different kinds of constraint the model in the first stage, and in the second stage, after we know the location and allocation plan, And after we know the exact demand value of the customers, so we're trying to assign the customers to the drones and the open facilities. And so we have a different a set of constraints. So constraint 6 means that serving customer I with the drone K located at facility G is possible only if the facility J is opened. And constraint 7 indicates that for each customer, it's fully served ratio, demand ratio can be should be less than 1. And constraint 8 is drones battery consumption constraint, which means that each drone has a battery and its usage during this whole process should less than its battery consumption, battery capacity, sorry. So, and constraint 9 here indicate the total weight of the packages at facility J should not exceed the facility's capacity. And constraint 10 here indicates there is a payload capacity of each drone. So, so that when you carry a parcel to a customer's, it can not exceed the capacity of the drone. And constraint 11 are just the different forms of XIGK. So in this model, we have 2 different kinds of models in this way because of how XIGK is assumed. So in the first way, XIGK could be binary or it could be continuous. So remember that XIGK is the assignment plan, which means that how do we assign the customers to the drones and the facilities? So if XIGK is binary, which means that it's either 0 or 1, so which means that a customers can only be served by one specific drone or not, and which means that the customer's demand the delivery cannot be split. You cannot serve customers using 2 drones. Say this drone serve 0.5 of his demand and this drone serve 0.5. That is forbidden when you assume XIGK to be binary. So in this case, a customer's demand can either served by full or not at all. So in the second case, when XIGK is continuous, which means that which we allow split delivery and partial service to the customers. A customer could be served by multiple drones, and each of drones served a small portion of its demand. And this is allowable when we assume XIGK to be continuous. So, and because these 2 different kinds of XIGK, so we have 2 different kinds of models. So in the first case, when the XIGK is binary, we adopt this drone's electricity consumption function proposed in 2017, where it is a linear function where the variables are the weight of the parcel, and the rest of them, the MT, MB, are the weight of the drone, and comma S, and these are just the fixed parameters. So once we assume that XIGK is binary, we can use this function and plug this function into the constraint 8 in the formulation, because 8 is and we plug in the function into this BIG because B stands for the battery. So this is perfectly fine. So we plug in. So now the constraints 8 look like this. It is the AIGK is a constant term for each I and J, and there is this linear function and multiple by a decision variable and less than a fixed value. So in this formulation, since SI and XIGK are both decision variables, a different kinds of big M method is used to transfer this formulation into a linear one. So this is perfectly fine to model in this way. But when the XIGK is continuous, we can no longer use the same constraints in model this way. This is because when xijk is continuous, it is kind of hard to differentiate between how, like, it's kind of hard to explain when xijk equals to 0. So when xijk equals to 0, which means that the customer I is not served at all. But in this function, it also means that a drone can go to the customer I, but carrying no parcels at all. So which means that, so the actual consumption function looks like this. Because when xijk equals to 0, the consumption should be 0. But when xijk is greater than 0, for example, it carries a small portion, a very small parcel to the customer I, the battery consumption is a constant term plus a very small term. And this constant term is because no matter how small parcels it carries, the drone, whenever a drone flies to customer I, the electricity consumption will always incur because of the tare mass of the drone itself. So even if you carry a small portion, a very small portion of the parcels to the customer, the battery, the electricity consumption is not close to 0 because there's a constant term associated with it. So look at this function, which means that this function is formed depends on the value of xijk, which is also a decision variable, which means that this function is this discontinuous function, and its form is based on the value of the decision variables. So, which means that we cannot we do not know the form of this function unless we know the value of the decision variables, which is impractical to formulate the formulation. So instead, we use a conservative estimation of the function. So the original function looked like this. It's a discontinuous function, but it is impossible to incorporate this function into the formulation. So instead, we use a conservative estimation of this function. Now, this function is also linear, but with no interceptions. So we find another parameter. It's called alpha. Alpha I is a parameter related to the customer I. So we assume in the previous function, we assume that MT plus MB is a fixed value, is equals to alpha I times the weight of the parcel. This equation always holds. This is a assumption of why we of how we use this function. I'm sorry. So yeah. So this assumption is clearly inaccurate because in this way we assume that each time a drone visits a customer, the weight of the parcel it carries is a fixed value, which is apparently inaccurate. But in this way, but this function could be directly plugged into the formulation, and also when the xijk is binary. So by using this estimation, using this simplified function, we can get an upper bound of the theoretical model of this theoretical model of the cost. So this kind of like we cannot formulate this using this original theoretical function, but we're using a simplified conservative estimation of the battery consumption, and we can generate an upper bound of the theoretical model. So in terms of the solution method, so just look at this objective function. So here we're trying to minimize a two-stage problem where the first stage is a fixed cost associated with the location, and the second stage we need to find the worst scenario. So that's why this max mark in here, and we're trying to minimize the total transportation cost and the penalty cost. So so the second stage problem is the max min problem. So and it's a linear problem. So we can derive the dual of the inner minimization problem, which makes the second stage problem as a max problem. So the second stage is a max problem. So now the whole problem becomes a min-max problem. And so we're using a column and constraint generation algorithm to solve this problem. So essentially, we want to find the worst scenario. Because we're using a robust optimization approach, we want to find the worst scenario whose cost we're trying to minimize, but we don't know the worst scenario in advance. So the general idea of this approach is trying to solve this large scale problem by only accounting for the important scenarios. So it is an iterative method where we fix the value, we fix the value of y here, and we derive the important scenarios of the second stage, and we plug the important scenarios into the master problem, and again, this process is continuous because we can use the dual formulation of the master problem and to derive the worst scenarios, and we plug the worst scenario into the master problem to derive another dual information. So we continue this process iteratively until there's no no important scenario could be generated, or all the generated important scenarios has already been included into the master problem. By doing so, we can reach an optimal solution of the whole problem. So it is very similar to the column generation and the binary decomposition, but the only difference is that we are not only generating the cut and add them into the master problem. We're also trying to find all the important scenarios we're trying to minimize and add all the constraints associated with the important scenarios into the master problem until we cannot continue to find the new scenarios. So in this way, we can find optimal solution of the original two-stage problem. So here it goes to the numerical analysis. So in this research, we're considering a robust facility location model. So we're trying to compare our model with two other very common approach of modeling the same problem. So we compare 3 different models in the simulation runs. The first model is our model where it's robust FLPD, where we anticipate the future worst scenarios when we're making the location allocation assignment plans. And alternatively, we have the one-stage deterministic model where when we make the location and allocation plan, we only use the nominal expected value to make all 3 plans, which means that we don't consider any future variation, but instead we're using an expected value to make all the 3 different plans. And a third model is called the two-stage facility location model, where when we make the location and allocation model, we use the expected value to do so. But when the actual demand reveals itself, we can adjust our assignment plan. So which means that in the first model is our model, we anticipate the future variation of the demand and we don't make any further changes once we make all the plans. And the second model is that we just don't consider any future variations. We use expected demand value to help us to make the location allocation and assignment plans. And the third model is that we use the expected value to make the location plan and location and allocation plan, but we can change our assignment plan once we know the exact actual demand value in the second stage. So we generate all the different scenarios and plug in all these different scenarios into 3 different models. As you can say, apparently the robust model have the least cost compared to the other two different other models. And in this simulation runs, we do not generate the worst scenario. because the robust model, we're trying to minimize the worst scenario. So if this worst, if we're only comparing the worst scenarios, it will be the robust model will be much better than the two other models. But in this way, but in our simulation, we just generate the scenario randomly. So to say how these three different kinds of models perform, and apparently the one-stage deterministic model has the highest total cost, and the robust model is slightly lower than the two-stage model, even we're not using the worst scenarios. And so this is for the different custom numbers. So this is a very preliminary result. We also test some very different kinds of results in terms of the sensitivity analysis of the parameters. So it's essentially the problem shows that even if we can grant an extra opportunity to change our plans in the second stage, it is always beneficial to anticipate or to consider the future demand variations, even in the first stage when you have such information. So so I think that's the pretty end of this research. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nice presentation. Questions from anybody? I guess I have a couple basic questions. I think implicitly you said that the drone will make a round trip from the warehouse to every delivery site and then return to the warehouse. Is that correct?
Right, right.
So in other words, I did not hear you talk about traveling salesman problem here at all, because I guess everything just a single round trip. But I guess as I guess as drone capabilities improve, then there could be a possibility that the same drone could make more than one delivery in a trip, and then I guess that changes the problem quite a bit.
Right. Yeah. I guess there's some research, ongoing research doing where the drone can carry multiple parcels with each trip. It's just like the vehicle, so
Right.
it can deliver multiple customers. But in this research, we'll only assume that a drone can only make can only serve one customer before it can serve another. He have to go to the facility and recharge, sorry, not recharge, but reload the parcels before serve the next customers. So,
all right, very good. Questions, comments, anybody? Well, Tinko, thank you very much. Thank you and Dr. Boyles. We appreciate it. Excellent presentation. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you. Let's start.
All right, let's see here. I believe the next item on our agenda here is skeleton graph, long-term 3D motion prediction from 2D observations using deep spatio-temporal graph CNNs. And Christian Claudel, my good friend, is an associate professor at the University of Texas. And I believe he is set. I see him looking anxiously on here. I believe he's going to be the speaker. Christian?
All right, yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Machemehl. So I'm very happy to do this presentation today. I hope you all can see my screen. So this work is called skeleton graph. So it's a long-term prediction of motion using deep spatio-temporal graph neural networks, graph CNNs. This is joint work with my colleagues at UT Austin, Dr. Wang, and also some students. So one of my students, so Abdullah Mohammed, who has been doing some work already for CAMMSE previously. So the objective of this work is to continue the work that we have done in the past on motion prediction, and the key motivation is in traffic safety. So traffic safety, as we all know, is a major issue in transportation, including multimodal transportation, in particular whenever we have users that are vulnerable users, for example, pedestrians, bicyclists, and other cars also, and so even drivers. We need to improve the safety of these users, and one of the idea that we had in the past several years was to use augmented reality, AR. So it's very popular these days. You have all seen the change of name, for example, of Facebook into Meta, so with the metaverse and all these things. And a lot of companies, including Microsoft, Facebook, and others, are betting on augmented reality. So augmented reality has some potential, and in particular for safety. So the idea would be to, at the end, to have a safety system that uses augmented reality goggles and that help us avoid collisions. The main issue that we have, of course, is collision between users, using some information that is propagated and that is sent to users directly in their field of view. So the guidance information would be provided, for example, as a 3D reference trajectories. So you could, for example, have in your field of view the trajectory that you should follow in order to avoid collisions. Or you could have some information, for example, if you're a bicyclist that is riding a bike, you could have, for example, some areas that would be marked in red that you shouldn't go to. For example, if you're about to turn left, and you shouldn't do that, you would see, for example, this highlighted in your field of view in 3 dimensions. That's part of a more general system where you have essentially a system in which every user participates, sends information to some sort of intersection manager that is a computer that decides what autonomous vehicles should do. Of course, if you have autonomous vehicles, what should they do next? And that would also issue guidance information to pedestrians and other vehicles in order to avoid collisions, but still maximize the use of road. For example, maximize the road capacity and maximize safety at the same time. So these are conflicting objectives, but we believe that we can achieve a very good trade-off in terms of safety while actually improving the flow of intersections. So one of the key issues that we have in this problem is the uncontrolled agents. So if you have an autonomous vehicle, it's very easy to send orders to the autonomous vehicle because you can just send target trajectories, and then you can have the vehicle follow this target trajectory. The problem is for the uncontrolled agents like pedestrians or human-driven vehicles, because they are supposed to follow, for example, some trajectories, or they might not even be equipped with the system at all. So how can we know in advance what they are going to do next? Because we need to know that in order to avoid the collision. So it's not just their current position that matters, but it's what they are going to do next. So that leads to the problem of predicting the path of uncontrolled users, which is something that we have focused in the past several years. If you have users that are just wandering around and you have some vision of them, for example, with cameras, how do you predict their future paths, what they are going to do next in function of what happened previously? So imagine you have a camera, you can see what people are, where people are right now and what they have done in the past. And what you want to do is, for example, over the next couple of seconds, the next 5 seconds, predict what they are going to do next. And the quality of that prediction matters. Of course, the more we can predict ahead with a high accuracy, the more we can plan trajectories efficiently, and the more we can, for example, have capacity in an intersection because we know precisely how to bunch people so that they don't intersect. So that's following some work that we have done previously. That was the social STG CNN. In that work, our objective was to predict the trajectories of users. So we had essentially users that were seen with cameras, and the objective was to predict what the users would do next. The key idea of this work was to model the interactions between users as a graph. So we had some graph that connects the users together, and we have some relationship between users that is encoded by some adjacency function that relays the users. And then we had some convolutional neural network that predicted the future positions of the users based on that. So one of the key limitations of this work, though, is that we measure the position of users with cameras. We had very poor definition vision. And in fact, we didn't consider the position, the precise position of each of the human body parts. And so we didn't consider the motion of the arms, the legs, etc., the joints in the body precisely. even though these actually have an important role in predicting future trajectories. For example, when you look at someone outside on the side of the road, their actions, their positions, their attitude, the orientation of their head, etc., their past motions have an impact on what they're going to do next. And that's how you decide if they're going, for example, to cross the road or they're going to stay on the sidewalk. So we want to use this information, and that leads to the algorithm skeleton graph that was recently published in ICCV this year. So the idea of skeleton graph is to do the same work as social STG-CNN, but using now the information from the pose of the human. So we extract from video data, we extract the 2D poses, so that correspond to the position of the head and the trunk, the arms, the legs, etc. We obtain a skeleton which corresponds physically to a graph of edges that correspond to the position of every joint in your body that are connected with links, and the links correspond to, for example, the links connecting the shoulders to the arms to the hand, etc. So in one pass, the algorithm computes, so it takes past the 2D poses information from cameras, and then it predicts in the future what will be the 3D position of the skeleton, because we have to do two processes, and we have to first somehow determine what is the corresponding 3D position of the humans, and then from there we have to determine what they're going to be next and what is going to be the 3D position of the humans next. So the algorithm works as follows. So here, yeah. So this is the graph model that we use. So we have joints of users that are represented as edges in the graph. We have an adjacency matrix that correspond to the connection between the edges on the image. So we connect, for example, the arms together, so all the joints in the arm, through this adjacency matrix. But not only, we actually also determine from the pose of the person the correlations between the joints. So, for example, you could have some connection when you are walking between the position of your hands and the position of your legs, because you have some balance constraints, and that make these things correlated. So that's the first step that we do, is to extract these 2D skeletons, to learn this adjacency matrix. And learning this adjacency matrix enables us to learn the connections that we have between all the parts in our human body. Then we used, in the next step, we extract some features from the image, so to use as much information from the ambient scene as possible. Then we concatenate this information with the graph that represents the position of the edges and the limbs, etc. And we run this through a time extrapolator, which is the predicting piece of the algorithm. And at the end, what we get is the 3D skeleton temporal graph, which represents the sets of future positions of the users as predicted from the past positions of the 2D graph. So that's a rough description of the work. Of course, there is I mean, it's machine learning, so there are a bunch of details that are hidden here, but that's just the general structure of the graph. So to train the algorithm, we have to use a loss function to determine what is the best way to learn the actual position of the user from video data, and then use that to train the algorithm. For the loss function, we use the classical loss function that correspond to the comparing one by one the position of every joint. But this is not sufficient, because we found that there are some regularization issues and there are some problems in learning. So we use two additional criteria for the training. So we use a one cosine distance criterion that correspond to the orientation of each edge. So we use the cosine of the edge essentially as a metric, the cosine, sorry, of the angles between connected edges as a metric to see how well we are for the training. And we also use another criterion, which is the L2 norm of the distance between edges. So we know, for example, that as we are walking, the distance between our joints remain the same. even though, of course, our body is not is a deformable body. So we know that the position of every joint changes in space, and the distance of any 2 points is not the same. However, the distance of any 2 points that are connected by an edge remain the same over time. So we use that additional criterion to regularize, and that allows us to get something more reliable. With this loss function, we have configurable parameters to tune the effect of these two things. So in terms of training, you can see the effect of that. So if you have some learning with just the normal loss function, that's the L2 norm of the distance between the edges, we have some things that look physically very different in the prediction, which is in yellow, versus the target that is the ground truth position of the person. You can see that sometimes you have things that are quite different. So in order to get a better prediction, which is the C, so the C is the integration of both loss functions, we use the norm loss that allows us to make sure that we avoid the problems of distances. And so here you can see on D, for example, you have some distance problems where the predictions distance of the distance between the joints, for example, changes over time, which is not acceptable. And then we have the same problem for the angles too, that are you can see here on the B example, the fact that the angles become progressively wrong because they are not well integrated in the loss function. So with these regularization terms, we have a better learning and a better ability to predict well with respect to the targets. So we use two key metrics to evaluate the performance of the algorithm in real life. So to evaluate the performance of the algorithm, we just take real data, and we just train the algorithms, of course, and from there we test it on different data sets. The objective is to measure some metrics of performance in terms of predicting the positions of the joints. So we have two criteria. We have one criterion that is related to the pose. So how well we predict the pose of the users. The pose means the attitude and the orientation, etc., of all the limbs. And we have also another term, which is what is the path of the user well predicted, because we also want to predict what the users will do next. So for now, because we have these two things together, we just took the average of the two in the matrix of error, but you can of course change that, and you can put more emphasis on the pose estimation versus the path estimation. So here we have two metrics. We have the average displacement error, that is the average error over some time horizon that you do, and then you have the final displacement error also, that corresponds to the error that you do at the end of the prediction horizon. So usually all algorithms that are published, they use the two things, the two metrics, average and final displacement errors. We also have another metric that we evaluated, which is the stability metric. So when you use machine learning, the problem is that it's a black box, of course. So sometimes it works well, but the key problem that we have is how well will it work in the future. So for example, does the prediction work well when you try to predict after 5 seconds, but does it completely blow up if you try to predict after 6 seconds? And that's a possibility. It's possible that sometimes the results are not consistent and are completely going out of whack if you slightly exceed the time horizon. So for this, we use a stability metric that will evaluate the variance of these errors over time to make sure that we don't have something that increases extremely fast at the end of the time horizon. So we evaluate the algorithm over two datasets, the GTA-IM datasets. I think it comes from a game, Grand GTA, but it's real life data that is generated from the users. And we use that to predict, of course, to compare the algorithm against. And we also use the prox dataset. So these are standard benchmark algorithms used in the literature. And we compare this with several algorithms. So our algorithm is the last line for both datasets. And the highest performance is the number in bold. So it's not always, of course, we don't always have the highest performance, but most of the time we have it across the data sets. And also the important criterion is that we have the best average final displacement error and best average displacement error. And we also have a very good stability in prediction. So you can see this standard deviation in terms of prediction. This metric, the last column, it's usually pretty high, but our algorithm is actually much less. So that means that the predictions actually tend to blow up much less over time. So that's a good thing, because that means that it's more consistent and more predictable. Right. So just as a brief conclusion, so this work has been published in ICCV 2021, and we're going to continue expanding from this work. So the objective of this work, just as a quick recap, was to predict the position of limbs in the future, as well as predicting the paths as well of people from 2D poses. We would like to continue developing this algorithm to improve accuracy, in particular, for example, to extract other features from the image, to do some better analysis of the graphs. For example, we could segment the image and we could extract what is the hand, what is the head, etc., to use that as additional prediction, because right now we have to train on that, but the more information we add, the better. Better image fusion methods to integrate the images, which is this step here between the vision extraction and the graph embedding. And finally, also a probabilistic approach, so that we don't predict only the positions, but we also predict, for example, some confidence bounds on our prediction as well, which is a key thing for avoiding collisions. For collisions, you don't want just to predict the path, but you also want to predict a bound of error around the path, so that you can have collision-free trajectories. Right, so that concludes my presentation for today.
Thank you very much. I wonder if anybody has questions or comments. I have a kind of a extrapolation question here, Christian. I wonder if this procedure, and you can just give me an off the top of the head comment here, because I know you haven't looked at this yet, but I wonder if this process would work better for older people than it would for younger people. And the reason I say that is I think of younger people moving faster and more erratically, and older people moving more slowly in sort of an expected pattern.
Yeah, I mean, possibly it's right now, I think we don't have too much information on this topic, because the problem is really to predict, to try to get a sense of how the past motion of the limbs has an impact on the future. So maybe there is more predictability, for example, for older people. At the same time, maybe the range of motion is less as well, so that might increase the noise, for example, in the perception and the determination of the position of the skeleton as well. It's really something that is difficult to say, I would say, on top of my head. But I think one of the things that could help really to me is the extraction of additional features from the image. And right now we are limited by the resolution, but just maybe getting a sense of, for example, the gaze, the orientation of the eyes, or other things as well that we don't extract right now. I think that would be also strong predictor variables.
Yeah, the eyes could probably tell a lot of the story.
Yes, and for there, I mean, the good news is that I've seen that, for example, some companies now that produced augmented reality headgear, they start to have sensors that detect the facial expressions, so that they can use that for teleconferencing, for example, in virtual reality, but also they can detect the eye orientation as well, the position of the eyes and where people gaze. So I think if we have this type of devices in the future, we'll have actually much more information to predict the future positions that we don't have access to.
Outstanding, great paper. Thank you so much. Any questions or comments from anybody? Thank you, Christian. That was great. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it very, very much. All right, let's see. I believe we're to the last presentation here. The title is Effect of Connected and Autonomous Vehicles on Supply Chain Performance by Ji-Yun Lee, Washington State University. And I'm very interested in supply chain, or I guess we're all interested in supply chain right now, since it's beginning to affect our ability to buy things at the grocery store, as well as many other products. So anyway, supply chain is a big question right now. So Ji-Yun,
So thank you for the introduction. I am Xianming from Washington State University, and today I'll be talking about the effect of connected and autonomous vehicles on supply chain performance. So transportation is the most essential component of a supply chain system. So transportation system supports the movement of products from raw material suppliers to final destinations. And the freight transportation costs account for a large percentage of total supply chain cost. Therefore, any changes introduced to the transportation system will have some effect on supply chain performance and cost. So as many CAMMSE researchers have already talked about recent advances in connected and autonomous vehicles on transportation system today, so CAMMSE may have some great potential for improving the capacity, safety, and efficiency of transportation systems and reducing some environmental impacts. So I'm not going to go into details about the effect of CAMMSE on transportation systems because it has been extensively discussed in today's symposium. So let me just recap very briefly what CAMMSE can bring about. So first, CAMMSE can enhance the roadway capacity by changing several factors related to driving behaviors, such as shortened headway or spacing between vehicles, reduction in reaction time, and smoother braking. And moreover, CAMMSE can also improve the traffic capacity by eliminating human errors in driving and reducing the number of vehicle crashes. So combined with increased roadway capacity, CAMMSE has definitely some potential for substantially reducing some delay and congestion. And then CAMMSE may also be able to reduce some fuel consumptions and emissions through the eco-driving. Okay, so such changes in transportation systems that CAMMSE may bring about will ultimately transform supply chain systems in many different ways. So as mentioned in the previous slide, CAMMSE may reduce the traffic incident rate and improve the roadway capacity, which will greatly reduce the traffic congestion and the travel time. And then given that the freight transportation cost contributes the most to the total supply chain cost, then the reduced travel time will greatly reduce the transportation cost and the associated supply chain cost. Moreover, by replacing some traditional human-driven trucks with fully autonomous driverless trucks in a supply chain system, maybe driver wages can be excluded from the total supply chain cost. And moreover, driverless trucks enable 24/7 truck services without being constrained by hours of service regulations, such as 14-hour limit driving per day or 30-minute driving break. Therefore, it can additionally reduce the transportation time. And the driverless trucks can also reduce some accident rates and subsequently reduce some of the losses due to the product losses due to the accident. So in a supply chain system, the efficient and timely delivery of the products would be possible. And then we can also think about some fuel and emissions reduction. And then because this is going to be another benefit of utilizing the driverless trucks in a supply chain system. So as such, CAMMSE may present various benefits for general supply chain operation and management, but specifically perishable or semi-perishable food supply chain systems will gain additional benefits from reduced transportation time. For example, for fresh food supply chain system, then the timely transport of the product is a key priority because of the rapid quality degradation over time. So if the travel time can be greatly reduced by the CAB, then the fresh food can maintain its quality during the transport, and accordingly, the waste disposal costs that retailers due to bad quality products could be reduced. And actually, this is a great benefit, given that 1.4 billion tons of perishable food is wasted within the global food supply chain system, according to the United Nations. Since the qualities of perishable or semi-perishable products are susceptible to temperature and degrade really quickly over time, food spoilage occurs during the transport between suppliers and retailers. And 3 reasons for the wasted food within the supply chain system were identified, including the poor demand forecasting, inefficiencies in transport and logistics, and truck driver shortage. And thankfully, the 2 out of the 3 identified sources of issues can be addressed by CAVs because CAV can reduce the travel time, enable efficient and intelligent routing decisions, and at the same time, it does not require any truck drivers if we utilize the driverless trucks in a supply chain system. Okay, although it is essential to understanding the effect of CAVs on supply chain system, very few studies have been conducted to investigate its effect on supply chain design, operation, and performance. And most of the existing studies are limited to conceptual discussion and or qualitative assessment, while quantitative information is important to understand how supply chain design and management should be transformed in response to the introduction and adoption of the CAVs. Therefore, to understand the direct and indirect effects of the CAVs on the supply chain system, this study develops a simulation framework for assessing the effect of CAVs on supply chain performance. So we first investigated the effects of CAVs on transportation system primarily based on secondary data, and then incorporate those changes into the supply chain analysis to quantify some subsequent effects. And then finally, a hypothetical fresh potato supply chain system is used to illustrate the framework and assess the potential effect of CAVs on the supply chain performance. Okay, so in the simulation framework, we consider 2 independent variables, which are the CAV market penetration rate, and then the adoption rate of the driverless truck, the adoption rate of the driverless truck. And first, the CAV market penetration rate indicates the percentage of the connected and autonomous vehicles in a general transportation setting, which may have some indirect impact on supply chain performance by changing the landscape of the transportation system. So in the transportation analysis stage number 1, we mainly assess the effect of CAV penetration rate on highway capacity, free flow speed, and the traffic accident rate. And then we calculate the total travel time based on the analytical model. And on the other hand, the adoption of driverless trucks in commodity transportation affects system performance directly. So it can directly reduce the number of truck drivers in a supply chain system, fuel consumption, greenhouse gases emissions, and the truck incidents. And then truck incidents can be related to the likelihood product losses during the transport. So this is the transportation analysis number 2. So in the supply chain analysis stage, the outputs from both of the transportation analysis are now incorporated into the supply chain analysis to assess the system performance in terms of the total supply chain cost, total transportation time, and total greenhouse gases emissions. Okay, so here, I'm sorry for the busy slide, but here I'd like to go into a bit more detail about the simulation procedure. So this is the fresh potato supply chain system I will introduce a few minutes later, but I stole this figure from the case study to briefly explain the simulation process. So these 2 green squares are the supply chain nodes, and then the products are transported from node A to node B, and so on, so ultimately going to the destination node. And then the route between these 2 nodes consists of multiple edges, and each edge has its own properties such as the physical characteristics, capacity, free flow speed, and accident rate. And CAVs in transportation systems will change some of these parameters, and the travel time on each edge can be calculated using the travel time model. So this is the first term in the total travel time equation. And in the transportation analysis number 2, reduce the number of truck drivers due to the adoption of the driverless trucks is calculated. And then it is also used to estimate the reduced driver wage and delay time due to hours of service regulations. So the delay of the hours of the service regulation is explained by the second term of the total travel time equation. And we also measure the supply chain system performance by using the greenhouse gases emissions. And since we consider only the greenhouse gases emissions from the trucks adopted in a specific supply chain system, so as you can see here, this performance measure is expressed as a function of only the number of the driverless trucks in a supply chain system. And then supply chain performance is also measured by the total supply chain cost, which consists of the fuel cost, driver wage, unmet demand penalty, waste disposal cost, and product losses due to the truck accident. And specifically to measure the waste disposal cost, the proposed simulation procedure should be combined with the food quality degradation model. So in this study, we track the quality changes of perishable or semi-perishable products throughout the entire supply chain system. So here, temperature and time are the two most important factors in controlling product quality in supply chains. So as you can see in this equation, the change in the quality of the product during the transport between the node I and node J is a function of the time, the travel time on the edge, and then the absolute temperature. And this plot shows the product quality degradation over time by holding temperature constant at 26 degrees Celsius. So for example, let's suppose that the total transportation time between supplier and retailer is 20 days when a product is delivered by the human-driven truck and CAV market penetration rate is low. Then the product quality at the retailer is about 53%, which is lower than the minimum acceptable quality at retailer, which is 60%, which means that this product should be disposed. And then now let's suppose that the driverless trucks can deliver a product within the 13 days with a higher CAV rate in traffic environment. Then now, as you can see here, the product quality at the retailer is now around 70%, which is greater than the minimum quality at retailer. So this is acceptable at the retailer. So the reduced travel time due to the connected and the autonomous vehicles can be incorporated into the food quality degradation model like this. So by combining the proposed simulation framework with the food quality degradation model, the reduced travel time due to the CAV can affect the product quality at the retailer as shown in this figure. And then it can also decrease the amount of wasted product. And then it can also reduce the waste disposal cost, which is one of the cost components. Okay, so the simulation framework is now used to assess a hypothetical fresh potato supply chain system. So we select this case study specifically because the fresh potato is a semi-perishable product that is sensitive to the timeliness during the transportation. And at the same time, the fresh potatoes and maybe processed potatoes are abundant in Washington state. So partly due to the climate conditions and maybe some soil types, Washington state produced the world's highest potato yield per acre, which is twice as much as the average yield in the United States. And then 20% of all the US potatoes are grown in Washington state. And among them, only 10% of the total potatoes are grown for the fresh potatoes. And then the rest of the 90% of the potatoes are processed. And Washington state potatoes are largely consumed in California and Mississippi. As you can see here, 25% of the Washington potatoes are shipped to the California, and then 31.9% of the potatoes are shipped to Mississippi. So for that reason, in the first part of the case study, we constructed a supply chain system having all the potato production nodes located in the Washington state and all the demand nodes located in California. And of course, the distribution centers are located near to the destination nodes. Okay, so in the case study, we consider 5 different levels of the market penetration rate and another 5 different levels of the driverless truck adoption rate. So if the driverless truck rate is 0%, then the aggregated transportation time can be reduced up to 34% by increasing the CAV market penetration rate from 0% to 100%. And similarly, when CAV market penetration rate is 0%, then the aggregate transportation time can be reduced up to 17% by increasing the driverless truck from 0% to 100%. So in other words, this transportation time is more sensitive to the market penetration rate as compared to the driverless truck adoption rate. But still, both the direct and indirect effects of the CAVs on the transportation is still very huge. And however, the different results are observed in the total supply chain cost. So as you can see here, driverless truck adoption rate directly reduces all the cost components and ultimately have a significant impact on supply chain costs. However, the effect of the market penetration rate on the total supply chain cost is insignificant. And it is mainly because that the fuel cost contributes the most to the total supply chain cost, and driverless truck adoption rate governs the fuel cost component. While the reduced travel time due to CAV market penetration rate that is also observed in the left figure reduces the waste disposal cost, but these two states, which are the Washington state and California states, are relatively close, and then the waste disposal cost is not a big issue in the supply chain system. And then the total emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, are only dependent on the driverless truck adoption rate. So emissions decreases as the adoption rate increases. So I didn't just show this greenhouse gases emissions in the figure, but I just show it in the number. So the waste disposal cost is not clear in this case study. So we use another supply chain system involving longer travel time. So now all the demand nodes and the distribution nodes are located in Mississippi. And contrary to the previous case study, total supply chain cost decreased by increasing the CAV market penetration rate. So in other words, the decrease in total supply chain cost in this direction can explain the reduced waste disposal cost. So as expected, the changes in all the 3 supply chain performance measures become even greater in this case study, indicating that the direct and indirect effects of the CAVs are more obvious in a supply chain system involving longer product transportation. Okay, so in conclusion, CAV could improve supply chain performance by reducing the aggregated transportation time, reducing the greenhouse gases emissions, and total supply chain costs. And more specifically, CAV market penetration rate has a greater effect on transportation time, while the adoption rate of the driverless truck significantly reduces the greenhouse gases emissions and total supply chain costs by directly affecting some of the cost and emission components. And the connected and autonomous vehicles could enable commodities to be delivered in a more expedited manner, and then it also can be delivered to the end users located farther away without compromising the quality of the product, of course. So therefore, the supply chain system, involving some perishable or semi-perishable products would greatly benefit from the introduction of the CAB. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and please feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you very, very much. Anybody have questions, comments? Well, let's see, I have a couple. Did you, I guess you assumed that autonomous trucks could operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that is our assumption, but I have to admit that that is a pretty conservative assumption.
Okay, well, that sort of ties into the next question. Did you assume that the autonomous trucks were battery powered or diesel powered?
Actually, we just assume that that is just powered by gasoline, and then eventually, like the human-driven trucks and like the driverless trucks are using some same fuels, but the only difference is like the hours of the driving per day. So for the case of the human-driven truck, they can just drive only 14 hours per one day. But in the case of the driverless truck, they can just drive 24 hours per day. So that is the only difference. So yeah, that are pretty conservative assumptions.
Okay. But of course, even the diesel powered truck has to stop for fuel at some point.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
You got to build that into it. So anyway, that leads me to the last question. I noticed that you're predicting greenhouse gas emission reductions for the autonomous truck. I guess they're not autonomous. They're just, well, I guess they are autonomous trucks. And that's sort of strange. If they're still diesel powered, does that mean that the computer does a better job of driving the truck than the human driver, or where does the greenhouse gas emission reduction come from?
Oh, it is more related to the transportation time. Because, yeah, as you can see here, let me show my previous slide. Yeah, so as you can see here, the travel time can be just affected by so many different factors, but eventually it will be affected by the market penetration rate and the driverless truck adoption rate. So we can see significant decrease in the travel time if we increase the market penetration rate and the adoption rate of the driverless truck. And then it is mainly associated with the travel time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a, Christian?
Yeah,
go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, I think it was related also to the same kind of question regarding the greenhouse gas emission savings. So for example, the fact of the autonomy, I think there are advantages beyond that also. For example, for the maybe reduced decrease specific fuel consumption in congestion. You probably do a better job with autonomous vehicles to dampen the congestion waves and something that you don't do necessarily with a regular vehicle. So I think there would be even added benefits in addition to this study.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, excellent presentation. We thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excellent job. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Fahn, I believe that's the last of our presentations. And so I shall turn control of this thing over to you. We're a little bit late, but excellent presentation. So Dr. Fahn.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Dr. Machemehl. So we sort of, as Dr. Machemehl mentioned, we sort of ran out of time. So I'm going to be very brief here. So we had a lot of a great presentation today. Me personally learned a lot. That's really true, and I hope you did too. And in the morning, we have a keynote presentation. Dr. Chris Hendrickson talked about steps to accelerate deep decarbonization in the U.S. And then we have two CAMMSE technical sessions, one on emerging mobility service planning and operation, moderated by Dr. John Ivan. from University of Connecticut. And then another one, the second one coming from Dr. Yi Qi, who is the moderator for the improving multimodal mobility and equity using data analytics, that session. So both, I think, sessions showcased the capability of our CAMMSE researchers to conduct high quality research. And then later on, we have Dr. Lawrence Relay had the second keynote talk about forecasting and estimating transportation metrics in the COVID-19 and the CFE era. And then later on, we have another invited speaker session on connected and automated vehicles, in which we have 4 outstanding speakers, Dr. Xianming Ma from Texas DOT, and Dr. Xuesong Zhou from Arizona State, and then Dr. Lily Du from University Florida, and then Dr. Brian Park from University Virginia. They shared their results and perspective on CFEs. And then we have this last session moderated by Dr. Machemehl. We have researchers from WSU and UT shared your latest results. Thank you for doing that. So looking forward, tomorrow we're gonna have 2 dedicated student lightning presentation sessions, in which we have a total of 18 students from all of our CAMMSE partner institutions. They're gonna make presentations. So we will have 3 judges who will evaluate and rate each presentation. And then based on all these scores, we're going to select and make announcement of the top 8 student presentation awards. And then we will send the gift cards later via email as well. So again, all the sessions and workshops will offer professional development hours. So please do not forget that we will start again 8 o'clock Eastern time in the morning. So with that, again, we're running out of time. With that, I would like to conclude the first day of our 4th annual CAMMSE Virtual Research Symposium. Thank you again to all the keynote speakers, invited speakers, CAMMSE presenters, and all the participants as well. So we appreciate that the time you spend with us and also your continued support. So I hope you all have had a wonderful day and enjoy your evening. So stay safe, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.